We're now confessing to killing his wife Shanann and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste.
It came in a jailhouse confession and featured in a Dr. Phil exclusive today right here on News 5. Our Sam Kramer taking a closer look at what we heard today. Sam.
Yeah, guys, well, that confession coming in a 5-hour interview last week with the FBI, CBI, and Frederick police at a Wisconsin prison, then relayed to lawyers for Shanann's parents. As for why it made the show, Dr. Phil says he wants to clear Shanann's name and honor all of the victims.
Bella walked in and asked, "What are you doing with Mommy?"
She knew something was wrong.
Almost 7 months later, Chris Watts finally confessing to killing his wife Shanann and two daughters Bella and Celeste, the crime happening after he admitted to having an affair and wanted a divorce.
And she had said something to the effect of, "Well, you're not going to see the kids again." As a consequence of that conversation, he strangled her to death.
The story shared on Dr. Phil through attorneys for Shanann's parents, a way of debunking Chris's first story that Shanann killed their daughters.
These tapes put to rest any of that kind of speculation, and that Shanann's memory can be put to rest as a loving mother and a caring wife.
And providing some closure for the family.
There's so much of this that happens that we become a little hardened to it and a little immune, and they want people to know this was our daughter, these were our grandchildren, we loved them, they were real people.
They say he wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet and put it in his truck, told his daughters their mom was sick and needed to go to the hospital, driving 45 minutes to an oil field. His rampage wasn't over while preparing to bury Shanann's body.
He walks over and takes Cece's, Celeste's, favorite blanket and smothers her to death.
Their daughter Bella pleading for her life.
At that point, Bella said, "Please, Daddy, do not do to me what you just did to Cece."
Before the same happened to her. 3 life terms and 84 years for those murders. Dr. Phil will air part 2 in an interview with Shanann's parents coming up on Monday.
It was the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. The kind that hums beneath the skin, whispering that something is about to go terribly wrong. On the evening of August 12, 2018, the Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado, stood still under the late summer heat. A 2-story suburban house, painted tan and trimmed in white, neat, calm, ordinary. But inside, the air was heavy with secrets. Because everything, every dark decision, every quiet betrayal, every unspoken goodbye, had already been set in motion. Shanann Watts was still in Arizona that night, on a work trip with her company, Thrive. She was texting friends, laughing, and talking about how she couldn't wait to get home to her daughters, Bella and Celeste, just 4 and 3 years old. She missed them. She missed him, too, or at least, she thought she did. But while Shanann packed her bags, Chris Watts was setting the stage for a future that didn't include her. In the weeks leading up to that night, his life had split in two. By day, he played the role of devoted father and husband. But by night, he was living a different life, a secret one, with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, the coworker he'd fallen for. She didn't know the full truth. Chris told her he was, in the process of separating, that the marriage was already over. But it wasn't. Not yet. And in that gap between what was true and what he wanted to be true, something inside him began to unravel. That evening, neighbors saw Chris standing in his driveway, staring into the distance, arms folded across his chest. He looked calm, but detached, like a man watching his own life from outside his body. Inside the house, the girls' toys were scattered across the living room. Their backpacks hung neatly by the stairs. Upstairs, Shanann's suitcase waited at the foot of the bed. Everything seemed ready for her return. But it wasn't a homecoming Chris wanted. It was closure. He had already cleaned, organized, and rearranged things that didn't need changing. He'd even sent a few final messages, routine texts to coworkers, brief replies to Nicole, a cold, "see you soon" to Shanann. Beneath the surface, though, something darker pulsed, a plan. Phone records show that Chris was up late that night, his phone pinging near the basement, not the bedroom. At 10:30 p.m., he opened a text from Shanann, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." He didn't respond. Outside, the Colorado night deepened. Crickets droned. The motion light flicked on, then off again. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train passed, a low, endless rumble that shook the quiet air. And in that stillness, Chris Watts made up his mind. By the time Shanann boarded her late flight home, the path was already written. Every step, every word, every moment that would follow had already been decided. Because before she ever walked through that front door, everything was already set in motion. The clock read 1:48 a.m. when the white Lexus rolled quietly into the driveway. A neighbor's security camera caught the faint glow of its headlights slicing through the dark. Shanann Watts stepped out, dragging her suitcase up the short walkway to the front door. She'd just returned from a long weekend in Arizona, tired, pregnant, and eager to sleep beside her husband. She had no idea that the man waiting inside had already decided she wouldn't live to see the sunrise. Chris had been awake. He'd claimed he couldn't sleep, but truthfully, he hadn't even tried. He watched her car pull in, his face pale in the flickering light from the television that wasn't really on for watching. It was on for noise, a distraction from the weight of what he was about to do. At 1:56 a.m., the door opened. Shanann entered the house for the last time. Inside, everything was eerily quiet. The girls were asleep upstairs. The baby monitor's soft static filled the silence. Shanann placed her bag by the stairs, kicked off her shoes, and made her way toward the bedroom, unaware that the world she thought she knew was about to shatter. We don't know exactly what was said between them in those final minutes. What we do know is that an argument erupted, one that had been building for months. Shanann confronted him about the affair. She had sensed the distance, the lies, the hollow way he'd been speaking to her. And in that confrontation, Chris's mask began to crack. Later, in his confessions, he'd claim it was just a conversation that got out of hand. But investigators would find that statement chillingly detached, the words of a man rewriting his own horror. Neighbors' cameras caught faint movement in the early hours, shadows shifting in and out of the garage. Then, silence again. No screams. No struggle loud enough to wake the children. By the time dawn broke over Frederick, the house looked peaceful, almost untouched. But behind that quiet suburban facade, 3 lives were gone, and one man's dark transformation was complete. When Shanann walked through that door, she believed she was coming home to her family. What she found instead, was the end of everything. Because by then, there was no turning back. The sun rose over Frederick, Colorado, painting the sky in pale orange, a cruel contrast to the darkness that still lingered inside the Watts home. By 5 a.m., Chris Watts was already moving with eerie precision. Every motion deliberate. Every second accounted for. Downstairs, he gathered tools from his work truck, gloves, trash bags, sheets. The garage door opened at 5:27 a.m., captured by his neighbor's security camera. In the footage, Chris moves quickly, almost mechanically, as if following steps he'd rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. What the camera doesn't show is what he was doing inside the truck, loading what investigators would later confirm were the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Wrapped in blankets. Hidden in plain sight. His own daughters. His pregnant wife. At 5:48 a.m., Chris backed out of the driveway and drove off toward his worksite at Survey 319, an isolated oil field 30 miles away. He texted coworkers along the way, pretending it was a normal morning. "On my way," he wrote. "See you soon." No one would have guessed what was in the back of that truck. Once at the site, Chris carried out the unimaginable. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the oil tanks, then placed his daughters' bodies inside separate oil batteries. The method was horrifying, chosen not out of panic, but calculation. He thought the oil would destroy evidence. He thought the truth would dissolve with time. By 8 a.m., he was already back to texting. He messaged Shanann's phone, pretending she'd vanished. "Where are you? Call me when you get this." Then he called her friends, acting confused, worried. When one friend, Nicole Atkinson, grew suspicious, Chris feigned innocence. He met her at the house later that day, pacing nervously as police performed the first welfare check. His act was nearly perfect, but not perfect enough. Because the neighbor's camera had caught everything. His movements. His timing. His lies. That morning, Chris thought he'd buried every trace of his crime. But what he didn't know was that the evidence, the footage, the phone records, the GPS data, had already started to turn against him. He thought the nightmare was over. But in truth, it had only just begun. By the time the sun reached its peak over Frederick, Colorado, concern had already turned to dread. Nicole Atkinson, Shanann's close friend, knew something was terribly wrong. Shanann never missed a doctor's appointment, especially one involving her pregnancy. She never ignored texts. She never vanished. At 12:10 p.m., Nicole called 911. She told the operator her friend was missing. That the car was still in the garage, her purse and phone inside, but Shanann herself was nowhere to be found. Officers from the Frederick Police Department arrived minutes later, knocking on the door of a house that looked perfectly normal, yet felt all wrong. When Chris pulled into the driveway, he put on a performance worthy of an actor. Calm. Concerned. Cooperative. He unlocked the door and let the officers inside.
Right now it's got K9 units, the sheriff's department. Everybody's like they're doing their best right now to figure out like if they can get a scent, see where they went. If they went on foot, they went in a car, or they went somewhere. And right now it's just like they've been on point. They're going through the house trying to get a scent, and hopefully they can pick something up to where it's going to lead to something.
What happened? Your wife came home. Tell me what's.
She came home from the airport 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here, and like about 12:10 in that afternoon, her friend Nicole showed up at the door. Like I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, say but she never got back to me. But she wasn't getting back to any of her people as well, and that's what really concerned a lot of people. Is like if she's not getting back to her, like if she doesn't get back to me, that's fine. Like she gets busy during the day. But she didn't get back to her people, which was very concerning, and Nicole called me when she was at the door, and that's when I came home. And then walked in the house, and nothing was vanished. Nothing was here. I mean, she wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Nobody was here.
What's your wife's name?
Shanann, Shanann.
What's your kids?
Bella and Celeste.
How do you spell Celeste?
Celeste.
How old are your daughters?
4. Bella's 4. Celeste is 3.
And so, how many times did you try calling her?
I called her 3 times, texted her about 3 times just to say, what's going on. Like because after I called her and texted her once, it's like maybe she was just busy. Like she had just gotten back. Like everybody's probably calling her from her trip. She just got back from Arizona, and I figured she was just busy. But when her friend showed up, that's what it was like. It registered like, all right, this isn't right.
Do you think she just took off? Do you think?
I mean, right now I don't even want to just like throw anything out there. Like I hope that she's somewhere safe right.
Body cam footage would later capture every second, Chris pacing, talking fast, pretending to be confused. But his eyes gave him away. Inside the home, the officers found Shanann's phone wedged in the couch cushions. Her wedding ring sat on the nightstand. Her suitcase was still at the foot of the stairs. Everything pointed to one truth: she never planned to leave. Meanwhile, the neighbor across the street, Nathan Trinastick, offered to show police his security footage. They all gathered in his living room as he rewound the clip from early that morning. There it was, Chris Watts, loading his truck in the pre-dawn darkness. Multiple trips back and forth, hauling heavy, indistinct shapes into the vehicle. Chris doesn't usually back his truck up like that, the neighbor said quietly. The officer nodded. Chris stood behind them, arms folded, his jaw tightening as the reality of what they were seeing began to sink in. When they stepped outside, the neighbor turned to police and whispered. "Something's not right with him. He's acting weird. That evening, the story hit local news: pregnant Frederick woman and 2 daughters missing. Friends, co-workers, and volunteers began searching the neighborhood. But deep down, those who knew Shanann sensed the truth: she wouldn't run away. She wouldn't leave her girls. And as investigators dug deeper into Chris's movements that morning, the threads began to unravel. His calm mask was starting to crack. Because while he thought his secret was buried 30 miles away, it had already begun to surface. By August 14, less than 2 days after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, the once sympathetic husband began to unravel under the pressure of his own lies. The media was everywhere. News vans lined the quiet street in Frederick. Reporters gathered outside the Watts home, capturing footage of Chris standing on his front porch, pleading for his family's safe return. But behind that soft, steady voice was something cold. "Shanann, if you're out there, just come back," he said, his eyes darting to the camera, his arms crossed over his chest. "This house isn't the same without you." It was a performance, one that millions would later replay, frame by frame, dissecting every flicker of emotion, every false tear. Because by then, the world already suspected what Chris couldn't hide: the guilt in his posture, the emptiness in his tone. At the same time, investigators were moving quickly. They'd pulled his phone data, tracked his GPS movements, and confirmed that his work truck had driven straight to the Survey Oil site the same morning Shanann disappeared. That same location would soon become the center of everything. When Chris was called in for questioning, his stories began to shift. He claimed Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house. Then he said maybe she'd left with someone else. Every answer contradicted the last. The agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation noted how calm he remained, even as the walls closed in. To the outside world, he still looked like a worried husband. But inside that interrogation room, investigators saw what he really was: a man cornered by his own deceit. The breaking point came when he agreed to take a polygraph test. It was supposed to clear his name. Instead, it sealed his fate. He failed, spectacularly. The machine registered deception on every critical question. When the examiner leaned in and said, "Chris, you know we can't lie to a polygraph," something inside him shifted. He went silent. His breathing changed. The mask slipped. And in that silence, detectives saw it, the look of a man who knew his time was up. Because once the lies start to break, the truth doesn't just escape. It explodes. The walls of the Frederick Police Department were sterile, quiet, and heavy with the tension of what everyone already suspected. After 2 days of interviews, false starts, and nervous smiles, Chris Watts sat in a small gray interrogation room, alone. On the table in front of him lay a photograph of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. The family he claimed to love. The family now missing. The silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by the faint hum of the camera recording every move. When investigators re-entered the room, they brought someone new: Chris's father, Ronnie. He sat beside his son, leaning in close. "They know you failed the polygraph," the agent said quietly. "It's time to tell the truth." Chris's breathing quickened. His shoulders sagged. The mask of composure he'd worn for days began to slip. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that sent a chill through the room. "I killed her." But even in confession, he lied. He told his father that he killed Shanann only after she strangled the girls. It was a desperate attempt to twist the narrative, to shift the blame onto a woman who couldn't defend herself. Investigators didn't believe him for a second. The evidence didn't match his story. But it was enough for them to arrest him on suspicion of murder. That night, while the rest of the world slept, detectives drove to the desolate oil field at Survey 319. Guided by GPS data from Chris's truck, they found what he had tried to hide. A shallow grave. 2 oil tanks. The air was thick with the smell of crude and death. Inside those tanks, the remains of Bella and Celeste were discovered. Nearby, Shanann was found in a shallow grave, her unborn son, Nico, still inside her womb. When officers told Chris they had found them, he broke, but not from guilt. From exposure. The truth had finally cornered him. In that moment, Chris Watts wasn't a husband, a father, or a victim of circumstance. He was what he'd been all along, a man who planned everything long before the first blow was struck. Because as he'd said in his own chilling words, everything was set in motion before she got home. When the case of Chris Watts finally reached the courtroom, the nation watched in disbelief. How could a man who seemed so ordinary, a smiling father, a quiet husband, a neighbor who waved from his driveway, have committed something so monstrous? But by the time the trial began, the evidence left no room for doubt. Every lie Chris told had been peeled away, one layer at a time. The phone records, the GPS data, the security footage, all of it told the same horrific story. He had planned every detail long before Shanann returned home that night. The prosecution presented a chilling timeline. The affair with Nicole Kessinger, the growing resentment toward Shanann, the deliberate removal of the girls' bedsheets, the early morning truck loading. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, a calculated decision to erase his family and start over. Then came the autopsy reports. The courtroom fell silent as medical examiners described the final moments of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Each fact hit harder than the last. And when the prosecutor displayed photos of the oil field, the grave, the tanks, the horror was unbearable. Chris's defense didn't argue innocence. There was no defense left. Instead, his attorneys negotiated a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for his confession, Chris would receive 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent.
Has considered the arguments made by the attorneys. The court has considered the statements made by the victims in this case. The court's going to find that the plea agreement is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. I want to acknowledge the Rusick family as well as the Watts family that showing mercy on Mr. Watts is understood, and I respect that decision to request that the district attorney not seek the death penalty in this case. And so the court is going to accept this plea bargain under the circumstances. Words that come to mind when I hear the evidence in this case are a senseless crime and the viciousness of the crime. And equally aggravating in this court's determination is the despicable act of disposing of the bodies in the manner in which they were done in this case. I've been a judicial officer now for starting my 17th year, and I could objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate, and anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. So the court is going to sentence Mr. Watts as follows. With regard to count number 1, murder in the first degree as it relates to Shanann Watts, the court is going to sentence you, sir, to a life sentence in the Colorado Department of Corrections, followed with no possibility of parole. And that is going to run consecutively to all but counts 3 and 4. With regard to count 2, as it relates to murder in the first degree with Bella, the court is going to sentence you to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. With regard to count number 3, the court is going to sentence you as it relates to Celeste to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. With regard to counts 4 and 5 relating to Bella and Celeste as a different theory of first-degree murder, the court is going to sentence you to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and legally those sentences must run concurrently as a different theory of first-degree murder. Recognizing the unlawful termination of pregnancy for the unborn child that has been named Nico, the court absolutely believes that the maximum sentence of 48 years would be appropriate to run consecutive to the other charges, with an additional mandatory parole period of 3 years as set forth by statute. With regard to count number 7, as it relates to tampering with a deceased body, as well as counts 8 and 9, each a class 3 felony, the court is going to impose a maximum sentence of 12 years each for those counts to run consecutively to the other counts. The court is going to order that the statutory fees be paid and court costs. The court's going to grant the prosecution 91 days to file a notice of restitution, and that will be the sentence of the court. We will shortly be in recess. I would respectfully ask the parties that you remain in your seat. There is a plan by the deputies on allowing people to exit the courtroom, so please remain seated until you are authorized to leave the courtroom based on the direction of the deputies. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.